Hello and welcome to the Quarantined Wargamer. I'm Big Lee, and today I want to discuss the apparently controversial subject of Undercoat. So today's conversation is basically being prompted by some conversations I've had online and a couple of old articles and forum posts that I recently come across. And actually I've encountered this subject several times over the years and sort of scratched my head a little bit at the apparent heated debate that sometimes associate whether you're using a primer or undercoat or not. So some people get quite hot under the collar about the subject. So today I thought we would just sort of discuss the topic, some of the issues that I've picked out from some of the forum posts that I've been looking at, and at the end of it I'll give you my opinion whether you like it or not. My choices pretty much generated from when I started painting 30 odd years ago. Initially, when as I've previously mentioned, my first ever models were painted with the paints that were available to me at the time, which were enamels. Terrible. I couldn't paint like that. I very quickly moved on to acrylics, and at the time it was very much Games Workshop was the sort of games that we were playing and buying, and a white primer was the standard procedure for us. Me and my group of friends, everything was given a white primer. And it started to become popular to start using blacks, and again I switched over. I tried black. I found it much better than the white for the sort of painting that I was doing, because it fills the gaps. That's one of the things that is often quoted about black primer or black undercoat, is that it fills gaps, and if you miss anything when you're block painting, it's not disastrous. It doesn't stand out as much as the white. Nowadays I tend to use brown of all colours. This was recommended to me by a friend a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago now, and I tend to use brown quite a lot because it's not as dark and light absorbing as black, for obvious reasons, but it's not as stark as a white, and I find that particularly on smaller models it helps you really see the detail. But we'll come back to that a little bit later on. Now, of course, you could use a grey primer instead. In fact, I have a can here at Army Painter, grey primer. To be honest, I've used that on a couple of occasions. I quite like that as an alternative to the brown, although I've got quite used to using leather brown as tends to be my primer of choice. So having spent a little bit of time this week looking back through some really old forum posts about undercoat or primer, I think a lot of the arguments, for me anyway, appear to derive from the terminology that's being used. A lot of people seem to use undercoat or primer almost interchangeably, and I've actually heard it said, this is a quote from one forum, it said that an undercoat is always a primer, but a primer is not always an undercoat. I'm not entirely sure I necessarily agree with that, but maybe that's my interpretation of what I'm putting on bare metal or bare plastic. So in theory, an undercoat provides a smooth, uniform surface on which to paint, whereas a primer is there to seal and bond to the surface of whatever the model's made of, some metal or plastic or whatever. So in theory, you could put a primer on a model, say a grey primer, and then put an undercoat over the top. I tend to use one layer. I always use the words undercoat and primer almost interchangeably, but I'm using that to refer to the first layer of paint that goes onto the bare plastic or the bare metal. So it tends to be a uniform colour that goes over the entire model, preferably thinly. You don't want it too thick. And on top of that, I will put what I would call a base coat. Other people tend to refer to that second coat as an undercoat. Confused terminology, but I would call that a base coat because that's the terminology I have grown up with. And for me, the base coat is the second layer. It goes on top of whatever you've put on top of the bare metal. And then, of course, on top of that, you put your highlight and your shading, you do inks or whatever it is your painting method is. So, like I say, I think there's a bit of confusion over the terminology, certainly depending on different groups, depending on where you learn to paint or what group of painters or company you're following and the advice that you're following, that sometimes the use of the words primer and undercoat gets used a little bit interchangeably, when actually rather controversially, I'm going to say I think they're the same thing really. So one of the things that I've found from the immense discussion on the subject is that obviously your choice of, and I'm going to use the term undercoat now, so I'm not going to keep saying primer, I'm going to call it undercoat. Your choice of undercoat is in some ways determined by the type of paint that you're going to use. So for instance, I almost exclusively use Vallejo paints because I find they have a dense pigment, very good coverage, and you can't see through them. Obviously things like yellow there's always a dodgy colour no matter what brand of paint you're buying, but on the whole Vallejo paint seems to be very dense in pigment and very good at covering. I have previously used some older versions of Games Workshop paint. I found them to be slightly more opaque, and then a white undercoat would show through them, so you'd need a darker undercoat to get the best effect from the base coats that you're going to put on. If you're using some of those older paints, I can't speak for the newer Games Workshop paints because I haven't used them. I haven't used Games Workshop paints in many years. And again, likewise, I've not used the contrast paints. Now, from what I can tell, from what I've read online, these are specifically designed for a white undercoat. So, obviously you would use a white there and not a coloured primer or a coloured undercoat. So it seems to me, and obviously, I've got very limited experience of other ranges. Like I say, I almost exclusively use Vallejo. It's just my choice. I'm not saying that it's the best, it's just my choice. I really like those ones. So clearly, the type of paint that you're going to be using will, in some extent, determine what sort of coloured primer that you're going to use, if you're going to use a colour. Black, white, brown, whatever colour. Then another factor will be whether you're going to spray or brush your undercoat onto your model. Now, Kevin Delamore, for instance, uses a brush-on primer. In one of his painting guides, he suggests a mix of 90% paint, 10% water. Totally agree with that. It's particularly with the Vallejo paints that I use, I have on occasion undercoated a model, and I've used that exact same mix for that initial undercoat, as I would like to call it. And it emphasises about making sure that you put it on thinly, and he tends to use a black. Now I almost exclusively use a spray paint for my undercoating of models, and I will tend to use one of these sort of like can spray primers because it's quick and easy. I find they produce really nice even results, but you do have to be careful with them. It's very quick when you're going to do lots of figures, but you do need good ventilation if you're going to do them. Now fortunately I can just open the window to my operations room, stick my head and shoulders out the window and do my spraying out there. I'm sure my neighbours think I'm crazy, wondering what the hell I'm doing, but at least I've got some ventilation for when I'm using my sprays. And the other thing is you do have to be a little bit careful. You need to make sure you shake cans properly, and you need to make sure that you've got a suitable distance between you and the model. It's very easy to make mistakes and end up over applying some of the spray, so you have slightly less control to a certain extent when you're using a spray. My preferred method for most of my models, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for you. Now, there are of course a wide range of coloured primers out there. Now, I've already shown you, the brown and the grey that I use. I've also got a sand coloured one that I use occasionally when I'm doing like North African vehicles. But there's a massive range of coloured primers out there. You probably all know about them, and I think they tend to be directed at a particular style. So you put a colour primer on and you do washes and stuff over the top. Nothing wrong with that. If that's the way that works for you, so that you can get lots of figures down on the table, I've got no problem with that. I would much rather see that method being used and an army fully painted than bare metal out on the table. My own personal preference. Now, as I mentioned, I tend to use a brown primer, and then I will block paint over that. Sometimes I might have to touch up model if they've got unusual crevices and stuff like that. I might have to go back after I've primed with a can, because I try and do it thinly, as I've already mentioned, and then I might have to just go back with a thin coating at 90-10 mix of a brown paint, just to make sure that I catch all of the areas and that the metal or the plastic or the resin even of the figure is entirely covered before I start. The idea is it seals the model in, it gives a nice even surface, and then you can do your block painting over the top. Now I personally think as well that some of the coloured primers are really only designed if you're going to be doing very light coloured figures, but then I've not used them a lot, so you please feel free to disagree with me in the comments. My impression is that they would work really well with very light coloured figures, hence the reason why I tend to go with darker primers and darker undercoats, the browns and the greys, because I tend to like that darker style, but that's just what I like. Does the scale that you're painting in determine what colour undercoat you're going to use? Now I personally find the reason I changed to a brown undercoat, a brown spray primer, was because I was doing 6mm figures for the first time, and actually I found that was just the perfect colour for being able to give a nice dark base, so that if you missed a bit when you was block painting in a robe or a face or something, it didn't show up as horrible when you missed a tiny little bit, because the brown was just a general standard undercolour. But also it was light enough that I could still see the detail. Let's face it, the Mark 1 eyeball's suffering a little bit as I get a little bit older. I need a lot of light when I'm painting. I've got 4 lamps currently over my desk. I virtually need sunglasses to paint by. But I need that extra light, and I need a lighter coloured undercoat so that I can see the detail I'm picking out, particularly when I'm working at very small scales. So maybe the scale that you're painting in might determine what colour undercoat or primer you wish to use. So having said all that, these are my recommendations. They're entirely my recommendations. It doesn't necessarily mean they're the right ones. So I would use a white undercoat only on those models where I want a really light or bright overall palette for the figure. I would very rarely use black, but I would use it on dark, gloomy figures, dirty peasants, zombies, skeletons, that sort of thing. I think it would work well for that, but not for smaller scales. Grey is actually becoming more of a favourite for me, because it produces a nice neutral effect and can be used across a wide range of different types of figures and scales. And as I say, the one that I use most at the moment is brown. It produces nice, normal, down-to-earth colours, very good for the sort of figures that I'm painting. There it is, that's the reason why I've chosen brown. And as I've already mentioned, it means I can still see the detail, but it's dark enough that if I do miss a tiny bit when I'm block painting, it's not the end of the world. At the end of the day, I'm not painting for a competition, I'm not painting to impress, I'm painting to get reasonable quality wargaming figures down on the table that I can be happy with. As I've mentioned, and I say it in all my videos, these are my individual opinions, these are my choices, my experience maybe, and please, please disagree with me. If you've got an alternative way of doing it, or you think I've got something terribly wrong, by all means, leave some comments. And I think that the colour that you choose to undercoat or prime your models in will be entirely down to your particular painting style. The colours I've chosen work for me. A different colour might work for you. So as with most things, I would say actually there's no right answer. Everyone's got an opinion, but actually the answer is what works for you. But I would always recommend that you try some alternatives out. You never know, you might discover something that revolutionises your painting. Well, I hope you found that video interesting, and of course if you did, I'd really appreciate if you'd hit the like button, and of course consider subscribing to my channel. So until next week, I hope you're all keeping well, keeping safe, and getting as much gaming in as you possibly can, and painting. Until then, keep rolling high.